Hello everyone. So for general principle number 6, a tempo becomes more important later in the game. So tempos of course are very important in the opening and the middle game. However, in end games where for example both sides are attempting to promote their pawns, oh yeah, you can be sure one tempo could be the difference between a win or a draw and a loss. That's almost certain. So yeah, that's why tempos are more important later in the game. So when does this principle apply? This principle is especially important in those endgames where both sides are trying to promote their pawns. Most endgames are tempo dependent. To know whether or not an endgame is tempo dependent, simply ask if I had two moves here, would it be extremely beneficial for me? Or one move or whatever. Okay, but yeah, two is better so that you can make sure. So when does this principle not apply? In endgames that are of the do not hurry type, which is an associated principle, which is a principle we'll take a look at much later. So tempos almost do not matter, and maneuvering for squares weak points is more crucial. So yeah, and these do not hurry positions where you can kind of milk the endgame, these tempos will not matter. And tempos obviously matter little in fortress positions, or basically not at all. So for the associated principles, first one, space is usually more important than time, Einstein, which is a funny one I've created. So however, since the concept of space makes little sense in the endgame, time takes precedence. So usually space is more important than tempos, but since the concept, there's no space in the endgame, which I refer you to meta principle number 5, I believe. There's the time becomes more important because there's no space. Kind of disproving Einstein, huh? No. Okay, second one, at the start of a game, a tempo is worth about 1/3 to a half a pawn. But in the end game, it may mean the difference between a win and a loss, so it's not worth that. That's what it's worth in the opening. And third associated principle, and king and pawn endgames retain tempos. Remember, in the endgame, tempos are more important, so that's why you should do that. That helps explain the king and pawn endgame associated principle. So the implication here is not that one should waste tempos earlier in the game, of course not. Sometimes a tempo loss in the opening could lead to the loss of the entire game. So just because tempos are more important in the end game, that doesn't mean they're any less important. That does mean they're less important in the middle game and opening, but that doesn't mean they're not at all important. So for the importance of the principle, on the exception scale, the exceptions to this rule are closed maneuvering type of positions. Since rook endgames are said to be the most common types of endgames, and king and pawn endgames are quite common as well, I would say that the exceptions to this rule are not as numerous, because in these endgames little maneuvering takes place. So I'd give this principle about an 8 out of 10 on the exception scale. On the importance scale, if one does not give any value to tempos later in the game, the result will almost definitely be a loss. Apart from the few positions in the endgame where tempos don't matter as much, there will be dire consequences to breaking this rule. Therefore, I would say this principle deserves a 9 out of 10 on the importance scale. Alright guys, so for the famous game, I'll be going over this very quickly. Anand against Katakamsky. They're playing the Rui Lopez. Yeah, I'm just going to go over this very, very quickly. Let's go even faster. I just want to reach the end game, but I thought for viewers who are interested to see the entire game, I'll show you it even though it's going to be very quick. Yeah, we get into this end game and black is going to show us some end game magic. Of course, it's Anand. And we're getting there, so this rook endgame will eventually become a pawn endgame. Alright, here, king d5, king h3, and now the critical move that you have to not know, but you have to see is king e4, gaining a tempo, because after king g2, there's king e3, and here you have gained a tempo. Otherwise, if you play, let's say, king e5, your opponent plays king g2, And now king e4, you're in the same position, but their king is already here, and you've lost the tempo, which is critical, because now if you start collecting these pawns, your opponent will take this pawn and be able to defend. So yeah, keep that in mind. Always it's important not to lose tempos in the endgame. For the other example section, so here black can't lose a tempo. They can't play g6. They have to play g5. Gaining a tempo, making use of this pawn's special rule, right? Special rule of the pawn. We kind of take for granted when you've been playing chess for a while. Yeah, so g5 is very important, and it wins the game. Let's see how g6 would actually lose the game, not even draw. It would lose the game because the pawn, as you can guess, promotes with check, and then it's able to pick up this pawn. In contrast, after g5, it is our pawn which will be promoting with check, and this is a technical win. Rather easy one, actually. I think everyone over 1500 knows how to win this. Alright guys, so with that, I hope you can now use these you can now realize how important tempos are. Remember, they're also important in the opening and the middle game, but they're more so important in the end game. With that, take care guys.